Hey guys, Archon here. Before this video begins, I'd just like to market the Archons of Cybertron Discord server. Right now we've got a massive Halloween event going on throughout the whole month of October, including a Halloween fashion show, a brand new custom night game mode that we'll be trying out, and some more fun stuff in the Discord. Make sure that you join and participate in the event because it's really fun so far and I'm really excited to do more of these. Anyway, as for our next endeavor in the Lore for Cybertron series, I decided that it was finally time to take a look at a faction that I have mentioned a lot but not made an actual video on yet. This faction has made quite a name for themselves, and have actually been around on Cybertron for much longer than people believe. From renegades of an unknown frontier, to guardians of Cybertronian relics, and eventually an elite Black Ops military coalition. Today's video is going to be going over the history and lore of the Wreckers. Long before the Wreckers were ever known as the Wreckers, they got their humble beginnings back during the ancient Cybertronian days of the Age of Cataclysm. For full context of the Age of Cataclysm, you can check out my complete history of Cybertron Part 1. But what's important to know is that this was Cybertron during the pre-Quintesson era, with the Cybertronians being unable to transform and the entire planet's surface recovering from a burning star passing by, and causing the extinction of much of Cybertron's Terranian wildlife. During this time period, much of Cybertronian society remained beneath the surface, with many warlords creating large outposts and towns to rule over, in the shadow of the failed Cybertronian world government. This era of Cybertron was defined by its lawless nature, and it is where an unnamed group of honor-bound vigilantes would find their footing. So the Wreckers during this time period are actually just an unnamed gang. However, because I actually have to refer to them by some kind of a name, I'm just going to be calling them Renegades for the rest of the video. The Renegades first started out as a gang led by the incredibly skilled Ultra Magnus and his old friend Cup, as they acted as honorable warriors who would venture out into the barren surface, patrolling Cybertron's lost frontier and protecting innocent Cybertronians from the remaining hostile wildlife, along with the ever-present warlords. Yeah, I think you guys can tell that I'm already so much more in love with the Wreckers than I was before. Learning that they were basically Cybertronian cowboys back in the early days is just the coolest thing ever. During this time, as roving vagabonds, the Renegades would take down multiple rival gangs, namely the Vandals and the Breakers, before hunting down the group known as the Ravagers. Nothing is known about these three gangs, as they were so old that the Hall of Records has no mention of them, and their only stories are told through the Wreckers' recollection of their early days in the gang. Life on the edge of Cybertronian civilization proved to be taxing, but ultimately the Renegades could prove to be quite comfortable with their place in society, with the majority of the lower Cybertronian class seeing the gang as respectable anti-heroes. However, dark tidings were awaiting in Cybertron's orbit, as the Quintessons planned their takeover of the planet. The Quintessons would inevitably worm their way into Cybertronian society, and eventually grow to control the newly reformed Cybertronian world government. Once they were in control, the Quintessons would quickly outlaw the Renegades, and place them on Cybertron's most wanted list. The Renegades would evade capture by the Quintessons for the remainder of their reign, and once Plan TCOG succeeded, and the Wrath War began, the Renegades would once again find themselves within the good graces of the Cybertronians, fighting alongside those they swore to protect. The Renegades would find their place in the Wrath War nearer the top of the Warriors, as while Sentinel Prime commanded from the rear, and Zeta Prime led armies alongside D-16, the Renegades would prove to be elite warriors, hardened by their time as outlaws, and specializing in going behind enemy lines to cause the most damage possible, while receiving as little casualties as possible, of course. Their remarkable performance during the Wrath War would soon prove bountiful once those that they fought to protect finally gained power. Once the Quintessons were beaten off the planet, and the Cybertronians once again ruled their own planet, the Renegades were obviously allowed back into society. However, by now the measly gang had grown a much more honorable reputation, along with growing in its capacity as well. As such, once the age of functionalism began, the roving Renegades quickly renamed themselves as the Council of Guardians, and were placed in charge of guarding some of Cybertron's most powerful relics, such as the core of the planet and the Well of Allsparks. Talk about an upgrade. These guys went from an unnamed gang to now being granted keys to the heart of the planet itself. Now if only you guys would do the same for me so that I can have more subscribers than Brushed Ranger again. The Council of Guardians would be placed quite highly in the caste system, with only the greatest warriors being placed within their ranks. At this time, the Council of Guardians would be reorganized. While Ultra Magnus was still their field commander and their formative leader, the Council of Guardians would find themselves beneath the jurisdiction of the High Council. Basically, the Council of Guardians followed Ultra Magnus, while Ultra Magnus followed the High Council. Once again, the caste system is just one big pyramid scheme. The High Council would utilize the Council of Guardians as a far more militarized unit compared to the Elite Guard, who were used as police during this formative time on Cybertron. Don't worry, I'll be making a video on the Autobot Elite Guard in the future where I'll explain all of their weird and super secret escapades. The Council of Guardians would be placed in charge of hunting down any remaining hostile wildlife on Cybertron. As such, any late surviving Predacons or massive Turbofoxes would be hunted down by the organization. The Council of Guardians were also deployed off-world as an elite military unit to uphold the laws of Cybertron on the colony worlds, with their most notable operation taking place on the first colony planet called Archon. What a coincidence. When a cult of doomsday prophets marched on the copy of the Well of Allsparks, intent on disabling the life-providing device, the Council of Guardians would meet them in what would soon become a massacre. The Doomsday Cultists were completely unprepared for the pure tactical might of the Council of Guardians, and as such, were easily killed by Ultra Magnus and his team, saving the colony planet until the Rust Plague outbreak. Once the Rust Plague took hold and Cybertron cut itself off from the colony worlds, the Council of Guardians were recalled to Cybertron to aid the Elite Guard in protecting the High Council during the extremely rebellious time. For anyone who's getting confused by all these councils and guards, here's a quick rundown, just to make sure that you all understand. The High Council is the highest form of government on Cybertron. The Council of Guardians are in the military, and the Elite Guard are just the police, in saying that the High Council is no longer about to be the highest form of government on Cybertron. Soon the Decepticon rebellion would begin to rise up, with the Elite Guard bearing the brunt of the terrorist attacks, though the Council of Guardians would take some blows too. The main difference is that the Council of Guardians absolutely terrified the Decepticons. While Megatron and most of the big names were able to go head-to-head with Ultra Magnus and his team, many of the more weaker Decepticons were easily butchered by this team, which led them to earning a reputation amongst their enemies as being a destructive force of law, leading to the Decepticons beginning to call the Council of Guardians by a new derogatory name: Wreckers. Once the Cybertronian Civil War began, the Council of Guardians would see the rise of the Autobot military, and join forces with them. While most people confuse the Council of Guardians as another sub-faction of Autobots, the Council of Guardians are actually their own entirely separate faction, who simply work alongside the Autobots because they have similar goals. The biggest difference between the two is the fact that while the Autobots believe in peacefully changing the systems of Cybertron, and changing the government with a slow but peaceful progress, the Council of Guardians still work for the High Council, the pre-existing government. However, early on into the war, the majority of the High Councilors would flee Cybertron, or go into hiding, leaving Ultra Magnus unable to receive orders from those that he was supposed to report to. So, Ultra Magnus decided to take hold of the faction and bear the mantle of leadership once again. By this point in history, the Council of Guardians had grown so large that they were no longer a simple Black Ops team or elite unit. Now they were their own entirely separate faction, with their own flags and insignias to boot. It is during this time that we see some of the more notable heroes rise within this faction. Iconic Cybertronians like Rodimus, Springer, Impactor, Topspin, Roadbuster, World, Twin Twist, Feast Ray, Rotorstorm, Pyro, and of course, the most legendary of all, Rack and Ruin. I'm convinced that this is not a real character. These are the true faces of the Wreckers, and they make up quite an iconic roster, with many of people's fan-favorite characters making their appearances within this separate faction. There are also a couple of dubious members of the Wreckers that may not fit in with the lore, mainly RC and Jetfire. While I can accept RC as being a canon member of the Wreckers, considering the only time that we ever see her in either campaigns was when she was in Kaon, so she's mostly free to go around with the rest of the Wreckers and have some fun. Jetfire, on the other hand, was rather involved in both campaigns of War for Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron, and as such, I find it rather improbable that he's a member of the Wreckers, especially after seeing how closely he works with the Autobot Aerial Division. Anyway, under Ultra Magnus's first act as leader was to fully embrace the name the Decepticons had been calling them, and he renamed his faction to the Wreckers. That's right, the ever-iconic name actually started out as a racial slur. Hang on a second, I have an idea. Hey Magnus. Wrecker. Immediately, they needed a main base of operations, as they had previously just been hanging around Fort Psych with the Elite Guard, staying close to the Well of Allsparks and Tiger Pax, but also their main outpost of operations was the Hydrax Plateau. So, as their first major act in the Cybertronian Civil War, the Wreckers would attempt to maintain control of the Hydrax Plateau from the Decepticons, who would attempt to lay siege on the Autobot-aligned spaceport. Right off the bat, Fort Psych had fallen to the massing Decepticon regime, and the Cons had set their sights on the nearby spaceport, marching upon it from the east. The Autobots knew of how important the Hydrax Plateau was, as it connected to Iacon City, the Autobots' main headquarters. And Zeta Prime would order a brave Autobot named Optimus to assist the Wreckers in holding off the Decepticon assault. The Wreckers were vastly outnumbered by the Decepticons to the east, and would soon be overrun and completely obliterated by the massing army at their south. However, before the Decepticons got the chance, Optimus and the Autobots would soon arrive to fend off the approaching Decepticons, allowing the Autobots and the Wreckers to hold out just a little longer. This is actually the first time in the lore that Optimus meets with Ultra Magnus, and because the leader of the Wreckers was not anticipating Autobot support, Optimus's surprise assistance would lead to a close friendship between the two Cybertronians, resulting in the Wreckers being more than willing to come to the aid of the Autobots in the future. However, despite the Autobot assistance, which was unexpected by both the Wreckers and the Decepticons, the Hydrax Plateau would still eventually fall to the Decepticons, with the Wreckers and the Autobots retreating to recoup their losses. The Wreckers would be hit particularly hard by this loss, as while the Autobots still had their capital city of Iacon, as well as Crystal City and Tegan Heights, the Wreckers had lost both the Hydrax Plateau and Fort Psych at the same time. While the Well of Allsparks was still within their control, along with a tiny portion of Tiger Pax, at this point the Wreckers didn't exactly have a home. They had no main base of operations, and as such were really uncoordinated in these early days of the war. Fortunately, the science capital of the planet, Tegan Heights, would soon be threatened by the Decepticon war machine, and the Wreckers would respond. You see, Tegan Heights was the height of Cybertron's intellectual individuals. Many scientists, such as Shockwave, Cogwheel, Perceptor, Wheeljack, and Ratchet, all found their way through Tegan Heights at some point in time. You know, it's entirely possible that if Cogwheel and Ratchet hadn't passed through here, that everyone's favorite Cybertronian, Cold Welder, would have been unable to go on to do such amazing things, such as disappear from the lore completely. While the Decepticons wanted the region for its abundance of highly advanced technology, the Wreckers simply agreed to defend the neutrally aligned scientists in exchange for a place to stay and organize themselves. While the Wreckers prepared to defend themselves and Tegan Heights, the Decepticons mobilized on the borders of the region with their newest weapon, a force which Cybertronians hadn't seen in many moons. A brutal combiner named Devastator. Yes, the Devastator and Constructicon video will be coming eventually. Once the Decepticons started laying siege to Tegan Heights, they were taken off guard by the presence of the Wreckers, who had prepared the entire city for a siege and employed guerrilla warfare tactics against the invading Decepticons. While initially successful in their defense of the city, the arrival of Devastator caused numerous problems, as the Wreckers didn't possess enough firepower to take down the Combiner, and were forced to avoid the Decepticon Combiner through the streets of Tegan Heights. Knowing that the Wreckers couldn't bring down Devastator on their own, Perceptor offered to take 5 of the Wreckers and perform an experiment on them to level the playing field. Utilizing Impactor, Twin Twist, Roadbuster, Whirl, and Topspin, Perceptor would create a Combiner for the Wreckers, a combiner named Ruination. Ruination quickly sought out Devastator in the heart of the city, and the two engaged in a crushing battle, while the rest of the Wreckers pushed back the Decepticons. It is unknown what truly happened beneath the rubble, but considering we know Ruination survived, and Devastator was never seen among the Decepticons again, one can assume that Ruination was the victor of the battle. Upon their victory and the Decepticons' retreat, the Wreckers were embraced by the scientists, and Tegan Heights became the first truly Wrecker-controlled region on Cybertron. The Wreckers would spend the next while building themselves up within Tegan Heights, rebuilding the city, and receiving more and more weaponry from the scientists. They would then begin to establish some smaller outposts around Tegan Heights, and one of these outposts would be visited by Ratchet, bringing a wounded Omega Supreme, corrupted by Dark Energon, to be healed. Once Kup found out, he dispensed one of the scientists, Wheeljack, to assist Ratchet in cleansing Omega Supreme of the Dark Energon corruption. The Wreckers' next big battle would be the Battle of Tiger Pax, which if you want a full breakdown of that battle, then I suggest watching the entire video that I made on it a little while ago. But what is important to note for this video is that the Wreckers would assist the Autobots in sending the Allspark off-world so that Megatron couldn't use it against the planet itself. The Wreckers would be responsible for holding off the main Decepticon assault force arriving from Tiger Pax, with Ultra Magnus, Rodimus, Springer, Ruination, Sea Spray, and Rotorstorm all being present at this battle. Meanwhile, Kup would remain at Tegan Heights and would command the other Wreckers in patrols around the region. The Wreckers would survive the brunt of Megatron's assault, though once the Mad Tyrant entered the battlefield, Ultra Magnus rushed the Decepticon leader in hopes of winning the war single-handedly. Unfortunately, the blasts from Megatron's fusion cannon would prove too devastating to the leader of the Wreckers, who would soon fall from his injuries. Right before Megatron could execute the leader of the Wreckers, Rodimus and Springer dove in to rescue their leader, with Rodimus barely able to fend off Megatron, while Springer pulled Magnus back to safety. Once the Allspark had been launched off-world, the Decepticons retreated, and the Autobots and Wreckers recouped to assess their losses. Ultra Magnus would be immediately rushed back to Tegan Heights, where the scientists would work to build Magnus into a new body. This is where we see Ultra Magnus survive and change from the body we see him in the War for Cybertron DS game, and the body that we would be able to play as in Fall of Cybertron. Upon Ultra Magnus' recovery, he would begin to look to the long-term survival of the Wreckers, and the scientists would begin to prepare a starship to carry themselves and the Wreckers off the dying planet. Right before they were scheduled to launch, Kup received word that one of the old scientists, Wheeljack, had fully cleansed Omega Supreme of the Dark Energon, and just in time, as they had also received word that the neutral archivist, Alpha Trion, had been arrested and held captive by the Decepticon scientist, Shockwave. Ultra Magnus ordered the majority of the Wreckers to stay put and defend Tegan Heights from any Decepticon scouts, while he took a small team consisting of himself, Springer, and Rack and Ruin to enlist the aid of Wheeljack and Omega Supreme to rescue the Archivist. Wheeljack and Omega Supreme would aid the Wreckers in their rescue mission, and they soon set out to Shockwave's tower to free the old Archivist. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why Ultra Magnus was the one to rescue Alpha Trion, especially when Optimus was the one to learn from him. My biggest guess is that Optimus was too busy with the events of Fall of Cybertron, and Alpha Trion represented the last neutral faction on Cybertron, and the Decepticons had just taken that away. Upon their arrival, they were ambushed by Ratbat, who was instantly vaporized by Omega Supreme. The Wreckers ventured inside, silently executing all Decepticons in their path, and rescuing a living Alpha Trion from Shockwave's prison. Once they left the tower, however, they found themselves on the other end of Megatron's ambush. While Omega Supreme stayed behind to keep the Mad Titan busy, the Wreckers fled to Tegan Heights, loaded Alpha Trion into a stasis pod, and presumably ventured off Cybertron, with Omega Supreme's sacrifice echoing metroplexes to ensure the Wreckers could escape the planet, in the search for a brighter future among the stars. So that's been the complete lore for the Wreckers and Ultra Magnus in the Cybertron games. Before this video ends, however, I just want to quickly talk about the massive inconsistencies surrounding Ultra Magnus in the aligned continuity. If you're wondering why I'm so valiantly against Prime being connected to the Cybertron games, this is an excellent example. You see, According to the Cybertron games, Ultra Magnus fled the planet shortly after Optimus Prime's call for Exodus went out. Ultra Magnus, according to Prime, was hunting down Decepticons across the galaxy. According to the Transformers Prime comics, he stayed behind on Cybertron to help the Dinobots. According to the book Exiles, he stayed behind to fight off Trypticon and perished with the rest of the Autobots. According to Robots in Disguise, he left on board the Ark at the end of Fall of Cybertron. According to the Aligned Continuity, Ultra Magnus was in like 5 different places at the same time, and none of it makes any sense. Furthermore, it's stated that he died on Cybertron before he ever got to some of his more known accomplishments, or that he even just left the planet before any of his known accomplishments even happened. So yeah, Ultra Magnus's entire story arc here is just completely unknown, but I think that I've done a pretty good job of establishing a good timeline for the character, where everything kind of works out and is pretty much as canon as it can get. Before the video ends yet again, just a big shout out to the Discord server. Make sure that you guys go in there and participate in the big Halloween event, because we're going to be doing a couple live streams and a couple custom game nights, playing a brand new game of Corruption. Anyway, thank you all for watching the video. Till all are one.